It's always the danger of giving 10 minutes with some refreshments, right? You know, we probably could go for a couple hours just discussing the first talk out there. But I appreciate you all coming back on time, and this way we can keep things moving, and I think we have some wonderful talks to come. Just a couple of things. You know, one thing that Groton alluded to, and I think it will be probably addressed in our next talk, and that is when I was asked about the President's press conference yesterday, the thing that I think we've got to be really clear about is that as much as contraception is a real issue in the Catholic Church, the real issue is about religious liberty. And the point that I made is that the President, as powerful as he may be, has no right to take away anyone's religious liberty. And therefore, I don't understand how he can compromise or give back what he never had the right to take in the first place. So I think that's the part that we have to be careful about, that we don't lose sight of in this whole thing. I also wanted to, two things I neglected when I first started is Mary Worthington, who is a special projects assistant in my office. I just wanted to thank her because she's right over there against the wall, and she helped really make sure all the details here were put together. So please thank her. And the other is that we're very honored to have Congressman Mick Mulvaney with us today, and I'd just like you to recognize him as well. He's over there. Our next speaker is Mr. Kyle Duncan. He's the senior legal counsel for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. His talk is entitled, "The Legal Challenges to Religious Liberty." And just to give you a little bit of his background, Kyle received his Juris Doctorate from Paul M. Herbert Law Center at Louisiana State University in 1997, where he graduated Order of the Coif and has an executive senior editor of the Louisiana Law Review. Sorry about that. Following law school, he clerked for Judge John M. Dewey, Jr. on the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals from 1988 to 99. He later served as an associate in law and received an LLM from Columbia Law School in 2004. He has argued numerous appeals in state and federal courts, and in 2010, he argued the landmark case of Connick versus Thompson before the U.S. Supreme Court, obtaining the reversal of a $20 million civil rights judgment against a district attorney's office. In 2011, he argued and won Adar versus Smith before the en banc U.S. Fifth Circuit, a seminal dispute over interstate recognition of same-sex adoptions. So I'm looking forward to this, and will you please join me in welcoming Kyle Duncan.
Now, I've been fitted with a microphone. I hope I'm projecting. Is it okay if I talk into both? Good. Thank you very much. It is an honor. I am very grateful and humbled to be here. I haven't always been a very good Catholic. I was out of the church for 20-something years and came back in about 6 years ago. And it's relevant to me being here because one major instrument the good Lord used to bring me back in was First Things magazine. And Belmont Abbey is on the back of so many of my First Things magazines, and I've never been here before, and it's a great pleasure to be here. My family and I have just moved here from Louisiana. I've just recently taken a position at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, which is a wonderful place. I can take no credit for all the wonderful victories the Becket Fund has had. And nor can I take any credit for the Becket Fund bringing this lawsuit on behalf of Belmont Abbey College. But now I can think of nothing else, and my life is now consumed with this lawsuit and with some other lawsuits. We just recently brought a lawsuit on behalf of the Eternal Word Television Network. There's also an instrument in the Lord bringing me back into the church. So the Lord obviously knows what He's doing and has placed me here, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. Now, I've been asked to talk to you about religious liberty. In reading and preparing for this talk, I've taken the liberty of retitling my talk. And that my talk is now called, "What Belongs to Caesar?" Because as we all know, the good Lord said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." Now, the good Lord does not give us any answer to that question, as He often does when He answers other people's questions. If we had asked Caesar at the time, I guess Caesar Tiberius, what belongs to you and what belongs to God, Caesar Tiberius might have said, well, whatever I say belongs to you, most everything belongs to me, and if I decide to make you burn incense to my image, then you're going to do that. And as we know, many early Christians were martyred for their refusal to burn incense to the image of the emperor. It seemed like such a small thing. Just burn a little incense, nobody know about it. Maybe they'd let you do it in a back room somewhere. When I came back into the church, I hadn't been confirmed, and I was confirmed, and I chose as my patron St. Thomas More. And when St. Thomas More was being asked to swear to the oath of succession, his friends and his daughter even at one point said, it's just a small thing. It's, just go ahead and do it. Nobody has to know about it. So that's the kinds of answers we would get if we asked Caesar Tiberius or Henry VIII what belongs to Caesar. So what if we asked the president what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? Well, I'd like to give you two examples from current religious liberty litigation that might give us some clues as to how the president might answer that question, what belongs to Caesar, what belongs to God. The first will be the Hosanna Tabor versus EEOC case, which the Becket Fund, no thanks to me since I wasn't even there when they did it, won an astounding 9-0 victory in the U.S. Supreme Court. And then the second topic that I think will give us an indication of what the president thinks belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God is the litigation that you are also familiar with against the HHS mandate. And I might say in passing, I certainly hope the comments that I make here today from this podium are more meaningful than the comments we heard yesterday at the president's press conference. Now, first, the Hosanna Tabor case. Who's familiar with that case? Show of hands. This is a good crowd. A few people, a lot of people are familiar with that case. This is a case about the so-called ministerial exception. I'll define that in a second. Whenever I'm talking to non-lawyers, and I know there's some non-lawyers out there, I always have to remind myself, talk like you're talking to normal people. Right? So I'm going to try to talk like you're normal people, and I'm a normal person. What's the problem that a case like that addressed? Well, I'll just tell you the facts, and then you'll see. A Lutheran church had a certain class of teachers in their school. This was Lutheran Missouri Synod. And they were called teachers, so they performed religious functions as well as teaching secular subjects. And so this church got in a dispute with one of its called teachers, and the dispute concerned whether she was fit to return to service as a teacher. She had been diagnosed with narcolepsy. And they were having discussions about when she might come back and when it would be appropriate. And at a certain point, she decided, I've had enough of this. I'm going to sue you under a disability rights law. And the church said, well, we don't do that, right? We think that the New Testament means that when we have a dispute internally, we resolve it internally. So it's a religious principle, and so we can't have you back as a called minister. And so the question for the secular courts in a case like this is, can you get involved in the dispute? Let's say, imagine, can we have a jury make the determination, well, were they really relying on their religious precepts, or was that just a sham, and they really just wanted to stick it to her because she's narcoleptic? So every court of appeals who has addressed a question like that has said, look, there's an exception to normal civil jurisdiction. The secular courts can't get involved in these things, right? We can't have that. We can't have courts mucking around in churches' business and making judgments about the validity of some religious doctrine, right? We can't sue the Catholic Church for gender discrimination because she does not allow women to be ordained priests. At least we hope so. This is the so-called ministerial exception. So every court of appeals out there, and there's a bunch of them, there's like 11. has said over the last 40 years, sure, there's some kind of exception, right? Common sense says we've got some kind of separation of church and state in this country, and if we have any kind of separation of church and state, I mean the good kind of separation of church and state, it means the government can't get in church's business. So every court of appeals over 40 years, remarkable unanimity from the people who gave us Roe v. Wade, when they agree, yeah, you're right, there's just some instances when we can't get involved. So the case goes up to the Supreme Court. The Becket Fund got the case granted. Wonderful briefing. And so here comes Caesar. Right? Here comes the administration. And the administration takes the following position before the Supreme Court of the United States in this case. Well, religious organizations, yes, we've heard of them. They're groups of people that get together, right? Yes, that's good. We like people getting together. We've observed that there are other people who get together, like the chess club, and the knitting club, and the social club, and the Teamsters, and the labor unions, and the the Elks Club. And they probably have a right to get together, and churches, they have a right to get together. But does a religious organization really have any more rights when they get together to determine who propagates their doctrine than the chess club? Nah, not really. Right? So they were scanning the Bill of Rights, reading it too quickly, right? And they missed the first one. So this position that the Solicitor General of the United States took drew, during oral argument, a comment. One justice said, "That's amazing, your position. Amazing." Now, who was that? Was that the arch-conservative Catholic jurist Antonin Scalia? The arch-conservative Catholic jurist Samuel Alito? No, it was Justice Elena Kagan, President Obama's own pick and former Solicitor General of the United States, who said, "I can't believe you're taking that position." So the United States Supreme Court unanimously, and those of us who have to read these fractured opinions that come out of the court where 5 justices disagree with 6 justices, and then there's only 9 justices, and you're thinking, how did we get to 11, right? Unanimously, the court said, no, there is a right that churches and other religious organizations have to decide who will personify their faith, who will be ministers, who will be religious teachers. And so this is a great victory. This is a great victory. A couple of quick things about that. I was just reading Professor Rick Garnett's article in First Things about the opinion, which is really great, because I know he's been a champion of this idea of the autonomy of churches. And he makes a couple of very good points. First being that this is just the beginning. We will be working out over time how broad or how narrow this kind of exemption is for churches and other religious organizations. So it's just the beginning and it's not the end. The second thing is that this is a wonderful history lesson for all of us about what genuine separation of church and state means. Genuine separation of church and state does not mean that federal judges get to play interior decorator every time Christmas rolls around, and we get to figure out whether if we put a snowman and a candy cane behind the creche, it's secular enough to pass muster under the Establishment Clause. And I kid you not. In law school, we would call it the 3 candy cane test. It's the rule of law. It's not natural law. It's unnatural, right? So what is the true and genuine separation of church and state? Well, that means that the government stays out of church's business, right? And Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, takes us all the way back to Magna Carta to show what real rights of the church are. And that's the third point, is that this is really not an exception to anything. This has to do with the rights of churches and synagogues and mosques and maybe other religious organizations too, we'll see, to determine how they are going to organize themselves and propagate their faith. It's very, very important. But getting back to our theme, what does this say? What is the president's answer to the question then, what things belong to Caesar? Well, the president sent the Solicitor General to the Supreme Court to say, who you hire as a minister belongs to me. And the Supreme Court unanimously said, no, it doesn't. It belongs to God. So, that's a good thing. Now, what about the mandate? We've already heard some discussion about it. I know you know about it already. I want to start with something that the president, the good president, said. He started with one of my themes, which is this really about compromise? I have been asked, not because I'm an important person, but because I work for an important organization, the Beckett Fund, by reporters recently, well, what would a good compromise look like? You know, you get this New York Times reporter who calls up and says, well, tell me, what would you be satisfied with? If we tweak this exemption a little bit, would you be happy with that? And I didn't really know what to say. And I'm not used to being asked things like that. What I said was, well, a good compromise? Well, it looks just like the First Amendment, right? That sounds like a good compromise to me, where people are free to profess and practice their religion without being brutally coerced to paying fines. That sounds like a good compromise, don't you think? Silence on the other end of the line. That didn't make it into the interview. So the idea that we are compromising is offensive. If we were talking about women's rights, or if we were talking about the environment, right? From the president's point of view, if we were talking about abortion rights, so to speak, do you think we would be talking about compromise? No, of course not. But we're talking about the rights of religious organizations, and so we're talking about compromise. So to back up, how shall we use the HHS mandate litigation and the mandate itself to gauge what does the president think belongs to Caesar and what does the president think belongs to God? Well, we might look at a number of things. We might look at the obvious brute coercion involved in the mandate itself, which, as our pastor, we've joined a parish in McLean, Virginia, and the pastor is a wonderful young pastor, and he said in a sermon that this sounds like certain societies where you have to pay a fine if you want to be a Christian, or you want to pay a fine if you want to continue to be a Jew. It sounds like if you want to be Catholic, you have to pay a fine. And I'll just tell you, I don't want to descend into the legalisms of it, but that creates a hole in the government's case that you could drive a church bus through, right? You just don't do that. You don't, in constitutional history, we have cases where, say, for instance, a Seventh-day Adventist needs unemployment benefits, and the state says, well, sure, you can have unemployment benefits, no problem, but you have to work on Saturday. And the Seventh-day Adventist says, but I can't work on Saturday. Are you bribing me to work on Saturday? That's my Sabbath. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You can't put people in that position. There's another case where a Jehovah's Witness needed unemployment benefits. The job he had been dismissed from was in a munitions factory. And he said, my religion prevents me from working on munitions. And the Supreme Court says, you get your unemployment benefits. The state can't do that to you. They can't put you in that position. So is this case stronger than those? We think so. Either agree to participate in acts that you consider to be gravely immoral, even up to the destruction of innocent human life, or pay $300,000, $400,000 in fines per year and kick all your employees off health insurance. Sounds like a good case. But let's not use that as an example. Maybe the president was mistaken, did not realize what was happening. Let's look at the religious exemption, because there we might get a really good idea of what the administration thinks belongs to Caesar and belongs to God. Because as you all know, there's an exemption, right? And so we're all breathing a sigh of relief that says, oh, great. The administration realizes that they're religious people whose consciences will be burdened by this, and so we have to have a carve-out, right? Leave to one side what you think of the idea of imposing universal contraception in insurance and then going about carving out people's religious rights to conscience. Leave to one side whether you think that is a sensible public policy for a nation whose founding document says nature and nature's God and inalienable rights. For a nation who has, in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right to free exercise of religion. Leave to one side whether you think this public policy makes any sense, and let's just look at the exemption. Now, you may all know this, but let me just make sure you know it. Who does the exemption apply to? Okay, well, let's imagine you're a Catholic soup kitchen. And so you're saying, okay, great, I don't want to have to provide this coverage for employees because I don't want to participate in contraception, sterilization, and abortifacient drugs. So what do I have to do to qualify the exemption? Okay, so your lawyer, you go to your religious liberty lawyer who has a shingle down the road and says, religious liberty, right? And the lawyer looks at the law and he says, okay, well, do you have any purpose other than transmitting religious values? And you say, well, we like religious values. That's why we're serving soup to hungry people. So he says, okay, so if you want to qualify, fine, just stop serving the soup. Okay, all right, check. Stop serving soup. Next, do you hire anyone who's not a Catholic? Oh, sure, yeah, because we like to reach out to other people, and people want to come help, and it's good, and we're able to witness to them, and they're able to participate in a work of mercy. And you say, okay, well, stop doing that. Okay, don't hire any more non-Catholics. Okay, check. Now, do you serve any non-Catholics in the soup kitchen? Well, I'm not sure. We generally don't ask when they show up to get the soup. We don't say, what's your religion? We just say, do you want some soup, right? So he says, no, now what you have to do is when the hungry person shows up, you have to say, what's your religion? And if they say, I'm a Jew, you say, no soup for you. Why are you laughing? I'm not kidding, right? This is the exemption. This is the exemption. Now, technical legal argument for a second. Can the government do this? No way, right? Not only does it violate free exercise, but it even violates the Establishment Clause, right? This is an actual genuine violation of the separation of church and state. And for someone like me, who, when I used to teach this stuff at Ole Miss, I would tell my students, all these separation church and state cases we're reading about creches and menorahs, and whether the students can pray at the graduation, these are not real separation of church and state problems. To get to real separation of church and state problems, you got to go back to 1783, when Virginia is saying, if you don't have a license to preach, we're going to horsewhip you out of Virginia, right? That's a separation of church and state problem, right? So now in America, in 2012, we finally have a genuine separation of church and state problem. Because when the government starts saying, our policy is that we like really introverted religious organizations, but we don't like extroverted religious organizations, then we have a serious problem, right? And this gets us to our question of, what does it say about the president's view of what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? Let me read you a quote. It's from a law professor at Notre Dame, Professor Sneed. This is a quote from his article entitled Obama's Freedom Deficit. Quote, "The vanishingly small religious employer exception tells us a great deal about how the White House misconceives religious practice. Notice how private this conception is, limited to sectarian activities that involve only co-religionists. There is no space in it for the living of fully integrated lives, with faith permeating every aspect of human activity." This tells us what kind of religious people the administration likes. The ones who keep quiet, the ones who don't reach out to others, the ones who don't incarnate their faith in acts of mercy to other people. I was asked at one talk, who does this mandate hurt? And I guess the expected answer is it hurts Belmont Abbey. It hurts EWTN. It hurts Colorado Christian, our clients. But who does it really hurt? It hurts the people that those organizations are trying to be Christ to, right? So it hurts the person who doesn't get instructed. It hurts the person who doesn't get fed. It hurts the person who is not ministered to. That's who it hurts, right? And so the author, and I'm going to use this, attorney-client privilege, please. I'm going to use this in a pleading at some point. I'm joking. There's no privilege here. The work of Catholic hospitals, he writes, social service agencies, and universities is a form of evangelization, of bearing witness to the love of Christ. And so, the administration doesn't like it when you do that. And apparently, the administration thinks that what belongs to Caesar is the power to determine whether you're going to be Christ or not in the world. And so, I want to have questions about this. Let me just close in this way, because I know this is something that we preach to ourselves at the Becket Fund and recently, especially with respect to this controversy. This is no accident. This is not a momentary oversight, right? A couple of examples. I've already told you about this extreme position that the administration took with respect to churches' rights in the Hosanna Tabor case. Let's not forget that the administration cut the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops out of competition for human trafficking grants. Do you know about this? You probably know about this. And why? Because the bishops, the Catholic organization wasn't being effective about helping the victims of human trafficking? No, they were very effective. But because they would not refer victims of human trafficking to abortionists, right? So in the conception of public good that the administration has, everybody has to have contraception for free. And if you're a victim of something, you have to have abortion as a means of healing what happened to you. What a perverse view of life and religion. I could go on. We have a document that we may put on the website at some point, I don't know, that sort of does a timeline of this kind of thing, of attitudes towards religion. Not that we're partisan, we're not. We're just observing a pattern, right? Let us not forget that this is the president who, when he was running for office in an unguarded moment, said, and I've listened to it, and it's very genuine, and I think this truly expresses a viewpoint, a worldview, that when people are frustrated and when they feel run down, when they feel that they've been cheated, they cling to religion, right? So this is a view that has persisted, and it finds its most perfect expression in the mandate that in order to be Christ in the world, you have to betray Christ. And so we will continue to fight this. I probably don't need to tell you that the compromise announced yesterday, it was a press conference, right? And so I suppose when Belmont Abbey or EWTN or whoever is being hounded by the IRS for its hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines per year, they'll be able to say to the judge, but there was a press conference, right? Because that's all that was. And I was, just to show you how fast moving this was, on my phone when I was in the airport this morning, coming here, I flew down from Washington, D.C., I saw that in the dead of night last night, the administration actually did issue a rule of law after the press conference. And what does the rule of law say? Well, remember have you heard the term interim final rule? Have you heard that term? I got to be honest with you, I'm not an administrative lawyer, right? And so I was like, interim final rule, well, that sounds like a little bit pregnant. What does that mean, right? Well, of course, as the administrative lawyers will tell you, there is no such thing as an interim final rule. It's final. So last night, at some point, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a regulation that said, oh, by the way, the mandate, it's now final. So take that for what it's worth. Nothing has changed. I am grateful to be here. I'm grateful to work for the Beckett Fund and to be able to, in that capacity, work for you. I encourage you, I implore you to pray for us. It's short, and we'll open it up for questions in a second, but just short story to show you that either we're under some sort of demonic attack at the Beckett Fund, or the Lord has a really, really perverse sense of humor. I was rushing out of the office on Wednesday to attend a talk. I was on a panel at the Catholic Information Center, which is a wonderful Opus Dei center on K Street. Why it hasn't been struck by lightning, I don't know, but it's a wonderful place, and it's got a chapel, and it's great. And so they were hosting a panel, and I was informed that day it's going to be on C-SPAN. Like, oh, great, C-SPAN. My children will stay up late watching it. And so I'm rushing out of the office, and I'm late, and I need to go grab a taxi, and I've got all my notes, and I'm walking out the front door of the office, and I feel this sharp pain in my foot. And I turned around and looked, and a workman, there's a lot of work going on in the lobby, had somehow allowed a large piece of plywood to be sitting there in front of the door, and there was a deck screw this long sticking up out of it. And the sharp pain was the deck screw impaling my foot. And I was shocked, not so much in pain at that point. I took off my shoe, and blood issued forth. And the building people came running, and I took out my card and said, I'm a lawyer. And they were very concerned. Anyway, I had a tetanus shot, and the x-ray's okay, and so it'll be fine. But the Lord, I choose to think we've held the devil at bay at the Beckett Fund, and it was the Lord speaking to me saying, you think you have it hard? Get a taste of a tiny little bit of what my son endured to save you. So do pray for us, and that we would do well, and that most importantly that the Lord's purposes would be worked out in this litigation, and that religious liberty would prevail. Thank you, and please ask questions. I've kept it under time.
Thank you very much for
You're
an
welcome.
outstanding presentation.
Thank you.
Can you give us an insight into the steps going forward and maybe a timeline on when you think a determination of the case might occur?
These things are painfully slow. We have brought lawsuits in different venues. Let me draw you an analogy. When I was a state official in Louisiana before I took this job, and thanks be to God that I was able to move here I love Louisiana, it's my home, but I had enough of Louisiana politics. In that capacity, I was the representative for Louisiana in the individual mandate litigation. Now that mandate, and you all know about that, right? The Supreme Court's going to hear that next month. And so the idea in those cases was that we would get different decisions from different parts of the country. There would be some disagreement or divergence among the courts, and so we could fast track them up to the Supreme Court, and that worked out well in that case. Because in order to get cases up, you need to show that there's some kind of disagreement. And we don't want to lose any of the cases, of course. But you bring different lawsuits in different venues, and you never know what's going to happen, right? But it's strategic. And so if you promise not to tell anyone, we hope that we get some kind of synergy among those cases and that they're fast-tracked. And so one might hope that if this persists and the administration fails to see the light, and they show no evidence of seeing any light at all, that perhaps we'll go up to the Court of Appeals in 6 months, something like that, and then, God willing, if the Lord wants to bring us to the Supreme Court, then a year. So these things are slow, but there are ways of speeding them along, and we certainly hope to speed them along in a way that gets the best possible decision. I think I'm sorry to be vague, but when you ask lawyers about their legal strategy, they immediately begin to obfuscate. Do you want to pick people? I don't. Thank you.
Again, I'll echo a wonderful presentation on a slightly separate subject, but still certainly religious liberty, and I think in your intro you have some real knowledge in this area. As an adoptive father, the area of adoption and Catholic Family Services being impacted, and I know this sort of limits at the state level due to constitutional issues, choosing not to adopt to same-sex couples, declared gay people, and Catholic Charities getting out of the adoption business because of that. What legal action has happened across the country? Where does that sit? And is that not a similar issue when you come down to it that we're talking about today in terms of the reproductive health, quote unquote?
You know, I've asked myself the same question because I've heard the same things that you have about Catholic Charities being run out of some state because they wouldn't place adoptive children with same-sex couples. I'm not, sorry, or other faith, that's correct. And so I'm not aware of what legal, it certainly does seem to have some analogs. The matter that I litigated for a long time in Louisiana was a variation on that. It was whether when one state allowed a same-sex adoption, in my case it was New York, could the parents, quote unquote, force another state to recognize them as parents? And in my case it was they demanded to be put on a birth certificate as father and father. And that comes under the rubric of this, I know you don't want to hear this, but of the full faith and credit clause. You may have heard mention of the full faith and credit clause. I mean, and in popular conception is that means that whatever New York does, Louisiana has to do. It's much, much more complicated than that. And we were finally able to convince a federal court in New Orleans that whatever New York did, that might be valid among the parents, but Louisiana public officials don't really have to recognize that. So, you know, as to your question about the adoption thing, you know, one basic principle here is if there's a law that forces someone out of business because of a question like that, the first thing we're going to look at is that law really being applied in the same way to everyone, or are religious people being singled out? Because a major part of our argument in the mandate case is one might think that this is a universal contraceptive mandate for everybody, but it's not. There's all kinds of exemptions in the law. For large corporations, for small employers, for certain health plans, even for certain religious people who have a religious objection to insurance, right? But there's no exemption for the people who have a religious objection to participating in abortion and contraception and sterilization. There's no exemption for that. So the law is not fair. It's not even-handed. And so maybe one day we'll see a challenge to, along the adoption lines, to that sort of thing. But I'm just speculating. I sure hope so.
Mr. Duncan, this debate has really focused upon the scope of the exemption and who it should apply to. Obviously, the Obama administration has come in and said, we think the exemption goes far enough simply by covering churches, period. And the debate otherwise has focused upon, at least most of what I've heard in the news, has focused upon Catholic universities, hospitals, et cetera. Where would you draw the exemption? In other words, it seems to me that when you get into Catholic
Are you with
hospitals...
the New York Times?
No. When you get into Catholic hospitals and universities, you're taking a step closer to the area of commerce. So would you draw it large enough, for instance, to cover the seller of Catholic books?
Oh, by all means, I would. I wouldn't draw it at all because it was already drawn. It was drawn in 1787. Everybody has the rights of religious exercise. Everybody. Institutions, for-profits, non-profits, individuals, Catholic booksellers, Catholics who run car washes, evangelicals who sell razors. Everybody. Everybody. I'm not trying to avoid your question. I'm just saying the circle is as broad as people are, right? That's how wide it is. That's this whole idea of we're going to expand it. It departs from completely the wrong premise. Completely the wrong premise. I think another thing this all says, and this is somewhat responsive to your question, is not only does it say what the administration thinks of religious liberty, but what does the administration think of civil society? Does the administration think there is any part of civil society that is outside the government? I was quoted, someone quoted to me what a certain representative near where I live said recently of the definition of government. Did anyone hear what the definition of government is? It's what we choose to do together. No. Having dinner with my family is something that I choose to do together with them, but it doesn't have anything to do with the government, right? That's not the definition of government. The definition of government, federal government, you can find it in Article 1 of the Constitution. It is a government of limited and enumerated powers. And then you can look in the First Amendment and find that one of those limitations is that it can entrench on people's free exercise of religion. So this idea of that civil society is me, the atomized individual, and the state, not in any country I've ever heard of. I mean, sure, I've heard of countries like that, North Korea. These comments are my own personal comments, I might add, and not those of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty.
Let's assume for a moment that a high percentage of college presidents of Catholic colleges are pretty familiar with this situation right now, given all the media on the quote-unquote religious institution component of this. Let's also assume that the directors of Catholic hospitals, a high percentage of them are also familiar that this applies to them. Let's also assume that other nonprofit religious institutions, whether Catholic, evangelical, Jewish, whatever it may be, but they are a religious institution, are also familiar that this applies to them. So high percentages there because of the recent media coverage. You can't turn on Fox News without seeing something about this, which is good. But I'm going to ask you an impossible question here to answer. What percentage of small and mid-sized business owners all throughout this country that is seeing in their living rooms on the TV every night that this is applying to all those other religious institutions, what percentage of them know that it applies to their small business that's selling widgets, that's selling tires, that's a construction company? What percentage of them know that it applies to them just as much as it applies to a Catholic college and a Catholic hospital?
I don't know the answer to that, but I bet there's one sitting in this audience. There's maybe more than one. They should sue because they are not covered. And believe me, the little fake rule of law that we saw from the podium yesterday, even if it were real, it wouldn't cover a for-profit business. And that's not even on the table. There is a bill that has been working its way around Congress that would cover individuals, and that would presumably cover business owners. I don't think that's going to, I mean, who knows if that's going to pass? I'm not a politician. And we don't, we support all that legislation, but we don't advocate for their passage. Yes.
Can I just ask you a follow-up to that
Yes.
question? I'm astounded that there aren't some groundswells coming from the non-religious institutions who are going to be impacted by this. Are they just oblivious at this thing? I mean, haven't you heard of any of them that are getting excited to?
We get a lot of calls, and we're, you know, one has to be, we only have a certain number of resources, and one has to be strategic about choosing, but we do get a lot of calls. I'd like to think that there's lots and lots of people calling lawyers all over the country, as well as calling their congressmen and saying, what can we do about this? But I think the question, the premise of your question is that people don't know, and I think they don't. And part of the reason is the focus right now on nonprofits and on universities and all that. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of focus, but we have to make sure to educate people that this is about everybody. I'm not a business owner, but if I were a business owner, I would be infuriated.
I think you got problems not only with the owners, but with people on boards of directors, people investing in companies. I mean, it's a huge thing.
Well, I mean, when you not that this is not about whether Obamacare is a good idea or not, but if you hand over that kind of comprehensive power to the government, why should we be surprised that what they do affects everyone? And as I heard in a sermon the other day, when you ask the government into these areas and the government says, okay, don't expect for it to be on your terms. It's going to be on the government's terms. I'll take as many as the president tells me to.
In the effort to protect religious freedom, how do you combat religious cults such as Warren Jeff, who is also claiming religious freedom?
Right, that's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, the laws against murder and rape, and you know, I don't remember what Mr. Jeffs was doing, but I'm sure it was something really bad. No one can claim an exemption from a law like rape or murder or theft. No one can. And the law is set up, actually, the Constitution is set up so that no one could even get in the courthouse door to do so. So that's the answer about the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution says if there's a general criminal law against smoking peyote, for example, and this is the case that was back in 1990, you can't say, well, my religion says it's a sacrament. Now, a lot of people disagreed with that when it came out, and I understand why. But that's the law of the Constitution right now is that if there's a general criminal prohibition, a religion cannot say, well, you know, I get to practice human sacrifice because I believe in the Aztecs or whatever. You can't do that, right? But it's a very important point that you bring up. What we're talking about here is nothing like that, right? What we're talking about here is this comprehensive rule that looks comprehensive, but it's not, because it's riddled with, it's Swiss cheese, right? There's waivers given out to, you know, exceptions, exemptions, all kind of thing. It's horse trading. Remember the circumstances of when Obamacare passed, the sort of, you know, kickbacks that were given to various states and that sort of thing. Well, the mandate is like that too. It's full of all kind of special interest exemptions. This isn't a one-size-fits-all rule, right? And you know, it's just a matter of legal sort of common sense. One of the greatest protections that we have in this country is that everybody has to live under the laws that are passed, including the lawmakers, right? That's a great protection against unjust laws. But when the lawmakers build into a law like this all these exemptions and exceptions and, you know, for all these different groups, then not everyone has to live equally under the law. And so the law's burden falls so heavily on the Belmont Abbeys of the world. And that's a real clue as to why it violates religious freedom. But your point is well taken. Religious liberty is not a license for crazy cults.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I read online last night on the Guttmacher Institute that 58% of abortions take place because the woman was using birth control in the month she became pregnant. I'm a little bit concerned that we're talking about a preventative measure when it actually seems to cause abortions. How would you respond to that?
You're absolutely right. Of course, when the government says preventative, they mean preventing illness or disease. they apparently also mean preventing pregnancy, which I suppose the government regards as a disease, just judging from their actions, right? So they have this worldview about what women's health means. And it's a worldview that is profoundly at odds with the worldview of people like Belmont Abbey and others. And, you know, what can you do about that? I mean, we can get the law changed, we can have a different president, we can have a different Congress, or we can go forward with lawsuits and say your worldview about what preventive health means stops at the First Amendment. I don't know if that's answering your question, but there is no answer to that question. It's just a fact. That's their view of what preventative services means. It's chilling. Is that it?
Just two things before we take another little break here. You know, one, I don't know if it's clear because obviously we're Catholic. The contraception issue, tends to focus in on a Catholic perspective. But the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty represents people of all faiths. They are not a Catholic-only law firm of religious liberty. And I think that's an important thing to know because sometimes when we talk about these things, you may say, oh, well, you have a certain bias and you're just coming from this direction. They really are truly defending religious liberty for all, for every American. That's their approach. But with that said, I hope we have a little more time for a break now where you get to chat about this a little bit more. Why don't we plan to be back here at 3:25, please? So please enjoy.